He was a ghost of the battlefield, a man trained to survive the world's most lethal shadows, but he never saw the strike coming from his own light. A Delta Force operative, decorated in valor yet confined to a wheelchair, discarded like a broken relic into the Montana abyss. They say the ultimate betrayal isn't a bullet from an enemy, but a push from the one who promised to hold you steady. Taryn Hale didn't just break a vow. She unleashed gravity against a man who had already given his legs for his country. She watched him vanish into the jagged silence of the canyon, expecting the mountain to finish what the war started. But death has a rival, not luck, not fate, a Belgian Malinois named Ghost, a four-legged warrior with tactical scars and a soul forged in the same fire as his master. He saw the fall. He heard the scream. And he refused to let the man who saved him in the Hindu Kush die alone in the dirt of Montana. Loyalty isn't a word, it's a pursuit. It's a race through a mountain storm, a battle against forged lies, and a stand against the woman who wore a mask of teal and tenderness while committing the unthinkable. This isn't just a story of a veteran's survival. It's a testament to a bond that even a 1,000-foot drop couldn't sever. Before we reveal the miracle that happened halfway down that cliff, tell us, where are you joining us from today? And if you believe that a dog's devotion is a gift from above, type LOAL in the comments and subscribe. This is the story of Jake Carter and the dog who wouldn't let him go. The morning air atop the Helena Ridge was brittle, tasting of cold stone, and the iron-scented approach of a mountain storm. Jake Carter sat in his motorized chair, the familiar weight of his military camouflage jacket offering a comfort that his current life often lacked. For 3 years, he had been the man who survived the insurmountable, a Delta Force operative who had walked through fire in the world's most forgotten corners, only to be grounded by a rooftop sniper in a final, dusty skirmish. Today was meant to be a celebration of resilience. It was their 5th wedding anniversary, and Taryn had insisted on the trek to the overlook known as Widow's Watch. She promised a quiet picnic, a rare moment to breathe away from the sterile hum of physical therapy and the suffocating walls of their estate. Behind him, Taryn pushed the chair with a steady, rhythmic gait. She wore a teal jacket that stood out sharply against the deep, brooding greens of the Douglas firs, her face a mask of practiced tenderness. "Almost there, Jake," she whispered, her voice honeyed but thin, like silk stretched too far. "Think of the view. It's the closest to the sky we've been since the accident." Jake nodded, his stoic gaze fixed on the horizon, though a flicker of unease stirred in his chest. A phantom tactical instinct, the kind that usually warned him of an ambush, which he hadn't felt since his final tour. Ghost, his Belgian Malinois, trotted beside them, his ears pinned back and his amber eyes fixed intently on Taryn's hands. As the gravel path gave way to the jagged limestone of the overlook, the wind began to howl, whipping the fog into pale fingers that reached for them. Taryn stopped just inches from the sheer drop, the front wheels of the chair hovering over the lip of the abyss. She didn't reach for the picnic basket. Instead, her grip on the handles tightened, her knuckles turning a bloodless, skeletal white. "Happy anniversary, Jake," she said, her voice finally dropping its warmth to reveal the jagged ice beneath. Before the warrior could process the sudden shift in her eyes, he felt the heavy, final click of the manual brake being released. The world tilted into a sickening, vertical blur the moment the chair's center of gravity shifted past the point of no return. Jake didn't scream. The breath had been stolen from his lungs by the sheer, cold realization of Taryn's final act. For a heartbeat, there was a terrifying weightlessness, a silence so profound it felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath in shock. Then, the scream of metal against stone tore through the air, as the motorized wheelchair plummeted into the gray mist of the canyon. He felt the wind whipping at his camouflage sleeves, the violent rush of air a cruel reminder of the high-altitude jumps he had once mastered in the service. But there was no parachute to pull this time, no brotherhood to signal for a pivot. He was a passenger to his own destruction, watching the rim of the cliff recede like a fading memory. Below him, the jagged teeth of the Montana granite rose up to meet him through the fog, promising a final, crushing end to a journey that had already seen too much blood. The descent felt like an eternity compressed into seconds, his tactical mind flashing with the faces of the men he'd lost, wondering if he was finally joining their ranks in the eternal silence of the earth. Just as the darkness of the ravine threatened to swallow him whole, a bone-jarring impact radiated through his spine, white-hot and absolute. The chair didn't hit the bottom. Instead, with a shriek of twisting aluminum and a shower of sparks, the heavy frame wedged violently into a narrow, V-shaped rock crevice 20 feet below the rim. Jake was thrown forward, his harness snapping taut and cutting into his chest, leaving him suspended over a 1,000-foot drop. Above, the silhouette of Taran vanished from the edge, replaced only by the frantic, echoing baying of Ghost. A primal sound of fury that promised the battle for Jake's life had only just moved to a different front. Above the precipice, the silence that followed the crash was more deafening than the thunder rolling across the Montana peaks. Taran stood at the edge, her teal jacket fluttering in the rising wind as she stared into the gray veil of the canyon, waiting for a finality that never came. She didn't stay to check the depths. She turned, her face settling back into a mask of rehearsed grief, and began the long walk back to the estate to play the part of the distraught widow. But she had forgotten the one witness who didn't care for human lies. Near the porch of the main house, Ghost was no longer the calm service dog who had napped at Jake's feet. The Belgian Malinois was a blur of tan and black fury, his teeth bared as he strained against the wire tether Taran had fastened earlier that morning. He had heard the snap of the metal, the rush of the wind, and the sudden absence of the heartbeat he was trained to protect. With a primal snarl, Ghost threw his entire weight forward, the muscles in his neck bulging until, with a sharp, metallic crack, the mounting bracket tore free from the timber. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look for the woman who had betrayed them. He turned his nose to the wind, catching the scent of Sam Whitaker, the only man who could move as fast as the coming storm. The dog became a shadow among the pines, a living projectile of fur and muscle tearing through the underbrush. He ignored the thorns that pulled at his coat and the rain that had begun to fall in heavy, stinging sheets. Every instinct honed in the valleys of Afghanistan was now focused on a single mission: extraction. He reached the caretaker's cabin in a matter of minutes, his paws skidding on the wet porch as he began to throw his body against the heavy oak door. His bark wasn't a call for attention. It was a rhythmic, urgent war cry, the tactical signal for a downed operator that Sam Whitaker would recognize even in his sleep. The hunt for Jake Carter had begun. Inside the small cabin, Sam Whitaker was hunched over a topographic map, the low hum of a shortwave radio the only sound against the encroaching storm. He was a man built of iron and memories, a former Delta commander who had spent a lifetime reading the wind and the shadows. When the first heavy thud struck his front door, Sam didn't startle. He reached for the sidearm on the table, his instincts instantly sharpening into a combat-ready edge. But it wasn't the sound of an intruder that made his blood run cold. It was the desperate, rhythmic scratching of claws against oak, and a howl that sounded less like an animal and more like a soul in agony. Sam flung the door open to find Ghost drenched, his fur matted with mud and his eyes wide with a frantic, piercing intelligence. The dog didn't jump or play. He paced a tight, military circle, his gaze darting toward the ridge of Widow's Watch before returning to Sam with a low, guttural rumble. Sam knelt, his hand finding the frayed, broken wire still dangling from Ghost's collar. The jagged edges of the metal told a story of a violent escape, one fueled by a necessity that transcended training. "Where is he, boy?" Sam asked, his voice gravelly and low. Ghost didn't bark. He turned and sprinted toward the tree line, stopping only to look back and ensure Sam was following. The realization hit Sam like a physical blow. He knew Taran Hale had always been a cold contact, someone whose smiles never reached her eyes, but he had dismissed it as the stress of caretaking. Now, looking at the broken tether and the dog's frantic behavior, the tactical picture became terrifyingly clear. Jake was immobile, vulnerable, and out on that ridge with a woman who had just ensured his protector was chained. Sam didn't waste another second. He grabbed his climbing harness and a coil of static rope, his heart hammering a rhythm of duty and debt. He had promised to never leave a man behind on the battlefield, and he wasn't about to start now in the mountains of Montana. Under the first crack of lightning, the commander began to run. Back at the sprawling main house, The storm rattled the window panes, but inside, the air was eerily still. Taryn Hale stood before the foyer mirror, meticulously smoothing her hair and adjusting the collar of her teal jacket. The adrenaline of the cliffside shove had settled into a cold, hard resolve. She practiced her expression in the glass. A slight tremor of the lip, a frantic brightness in the eyes, the hollow look of a wife whose world had just collapsed. She wasn't just a woman anymore. She was an actress preparing for the role of a lifetime. Satisfied with the mask, she grabbed her keys and drove through the pouring rain to the law offices of Miller and Associates in downtown Helena. The Mahogany Row office felt like a sanctuary of greed. Mr. Miller looked up, startled by her disheveled appearance as she burst through the doors. "He's gone," she gasped, the lie tasting like copper. "We were at the Overlook. The wind was so strong. I turned my back for 1 second to grab his shawl, and when I looked back, the chair was gone. I searched the edge, but there was nothing but fog." She sank into a leather chair, hiding her face in her hands to conceal the lack of tears. She wasn't there for comfort. She was there to trigger the missing person clause in Jake's estate, a specific legal loophole she had spent months researching. With Jake presumed dead in the inaccessible ravine and his mental instability already documented in her forged records, the path to his military pension and the land was clear. "I need to know the next steps," she whispered, her voice a perfect blend of grief and desperation. Jake would have wanted the estate handled quickly. He always hated loose ends. As the lawyer reached for a file, Taryn felt a surge of triumph. She believed the mountain had done her dirty work, unaware that miles away, a dog was screaming her secrets to the wind. The sky over Widow's Watch had finally buckled, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the limestone cliffs into a slick, treacherous slide. Sam Whitaker stood at the edge of the abyss, his tactical boots skidding on the mud as he hammered a heavy-duty piton into the granite. Behind him, Ghost paced with a low, anxious whine, his eyes never leaving the gray void where his master had vanished. "Stay, Ghost," Sam commanded, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. With a sharp tug on his harness, Sam stepped backward into the nothingness, his life hanging by a single strand of static rope. The descent was a nightmare of vertical shadows and stinging rain. Every time the lightning fractured the sky, Sam caught glimpses of the twisted wreckage of the wheelchair wedged precariously in a narrow crevice 20 feet below. Jake was slumped forward, the only thing keeping him from a 1,000-foot plunge being the frayed nylon of his safety harness and the sheer friction of the chair's frame against the rock. As Sam kicked off the cliff face to swing inward, a sickening grind of stone against metal echoed through the ravine. The rock shelf holding the chair was beginning to crumble, the heavy rains lubricating the debris that kept Jake suspended. "Jake, eyes on me," Sam roared, reaching out as he swung toward the crevice. Jake's head lifted, his face pale and battered, but the fire of a Delta operator still flickered in his gaze. Just as Sam's fingers brushed the cold metal of the chair, a large chunk of limestone broke free, plummeting into the darkness. The chair shifted, tilting toward the drop. With a surge of adrenaline, Sam locked his descender and threw his arms around his friend, anchoring Jake's body to his own chest. The rock shelf gave way completely, falling into the fog with a distant crash, leaving the two veterans dangling in the heart of the storm, bound together by rope and a brotherhood that refused to break. While the storm raged against the high peaks, a different kind of tempest was brewing within the silent corridors of the Carter estate. Elise Rowan, the longtime housekeeper who had served Jake since his return from overseas, moved through the kitchen with a heavy heart. The house felt hollow, poisoned by the rehearsed tears Taryn had shed before rushing out to meet her lawyer. Elise had seen many things in her years of service, but the cold precision of Taryn's grief sat in her stomach like lead. It was as she went to empty the waste bin beneath the heavy oak island that she noticed the unusual volume of paper, thick, high-quality bond that didn't belong in a kitchen trash can. Curiosity turned to a cold, prickling dread as she pulled out a handful of white strips. They had been shredded by hand, hastily torn into jagged ribbons. Clearing the marble countertop, Elise began a slow, methodical reconstruction, her hands trembling as the words began to align. It wasn't a grocery list or a discarded letter. Under the harsh glow of the pendant lights, the fragments revealed a power of attorney and a medical evaluation dated weeks prior. The documents claimed that Jake Carter was suffering from severe cognitive decline and was unfit to manage his own affairs. A blatant lie that contradicted the sharp, tactical mind Elise spoke with every morning. The more she pieced together, the darker the truth became. She found a signature line where Jake's name had been traced with a shaky, unfamiliar hand, a forgery meant to sign away his land, his pension, and his very autonomy. Taryn hadn't just pushed him off a cliff today. She had been erasing him from his own life for months. Elise looked toward the darkened window, the lightning illuminating her reflection. She realized then that she held the motive for a murder in her hands. If Jake was still out there, clinging to the side of that mountain, these papers were the only thing that would ensure his betrayer never spent another night under this roof. Clutching the scraps to her chest, Elise reached for her phone to call the only person Jake trusted, Sam Whitaker. The sterile, white-tiled corridors of St. Peter's Health felt like a different world compared to the rain-lashed cliffs, but the tension within the trauma bay was no less lethal. Jake lay beneath a tangle of tubes and monitors, his breathing assisted by a rhythmic hiss that served as the only sound in the room, until the double doors swung open. Taryn entered, her teal jacket now damp and clinging to her shoulders, her face twisted into a mask of hysterical grief. She rushed toward the bed, her hands reaching out as if to touch the man she had tried to erase from the earth. "Oh, Jake, thank God you're alive," she sobbed, her voice echoing with a hollow, theatrical vibrato. But she never reached him. Ghost, who had refused to leave the bedside despite the protests of the nursing staff, rose with a slow, predatory grace. There was no bark, no playful warning. Instead, a low, vibrating growl started deep in the Malinois chest, a sound that Sam Whitaker recognized as the tactical threat lock Ghost used on the battlefield. The dog's lips curled back to reveal gleaming teeth, his hackles rising like a line of bayonets. He stepped between Taryn and the bed, his amber eyes fixed on her with a piercing, cold intelligence that seemed to see right through her teal-colored facade. Taryn froze, her fake tears drying instantly as she looked into the eyes of the one witness she couldn't bribe or bury. She tried to take a step back, but Ghost followed her movement, the growl intensifying into a rhythmic snarl that vibrated through the floorboards. The medical staff watched in stunned silence as the dog, usually a gentle service companion, identified the predator in the room with unerring accuracy. At that moment, Sam Whitaker stepped into the doorway, his arms folded and his expression like flint. He didn't need a confession. He had the dog's testimony, and Ghost was making it clear. The woman in teal was no longer welcome in the presence of the hero she had betrayed. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator had finally ceased, replaced by the shallow, raspy sounds of a man reclaiming his own breath. Jake Carter's eyes fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the ICU burning like a desert sun. For a moment, the fog of anesthesia threatened to pull him back into the abyss, but then he felt a familiar, heavy warmth resting against his hand. Ghost was there, his chin resting on the edge of the mattress, his amber eyes locked onto Jake, with an intensity that demanded presence. Slowly, the fractured memories of the cliff, the free fall, and the teal jacket coalesced into a cold, hard certainty. Detective Hart sat in the corner, his notebook open, his expression a mixture of reverence and grim duty. He had seen the shredded documents Elise had recovered and heard Sam's account of the rescue, but the law required a voice from the victim. As Jake's hand moved to feebly scratch Ghost's ears, Sam leaned in. "Take your time, Jake. You're safe now." Jake swallowed hard, his throat feeling as though it were filled with Montana gravel. He didn't look for Taryn. He didn't need to. He looked at the detective, the fire of a Delta Force operative reigniting in his gaze, sharp and tactical. "The brakes," Jake whispered, his voice a ghost of its former strength but steady. "She didn't just forget them, she clicked them off. She looked me in the eye, and she pushed." The room went silent, the weight of the confession settling like a shroud. He detailed the months of Taryn's growing distance, the way she had isolated him, and the final, chilling words she had spoken before the plunge. It wasn't a victim's plea. It was an after-action report, precise, devastating, and final. As the detective nodded and signaled to the officers waiting in the hall, Jake closed his eyes and felt Ghost's tail thump once against the hospital floor. The mission was finally over. A year had passed since the thunder rolled over Widow's Watch, But the air at the edge of the timberline felt different now, clearer, lighter, and stripped of the shadows that had once haunted the Carter estate. Jake sat on the cedar porch of his new home, a custom-built cabin designed by his former Delta teammates and constructed by the hands of men who understood that a soldier's home is his fortress. The wood was still fragrant with the scent of sap and oil, a sharp contrast to the cold, marble silence of the life he had left behind. Taryn was gone, serving a 20-year sentence in a state penitentiary, her glass mask shattered by the very evidence she had tried to shred. Beside Jake, Ghost lay with his full weight pressed against the wheelchair's tires, his tail thumping a steady, rhythmic greeting as a familiar truck rumbled up the gravel drive. Sam Whitaker hopped out, carrying a crate of supplies and a stack of mail that grew larger with every passing month. "More letters from the Foundation, Jake," Sam said with a grin, tossing a heavy envelope onto the porch table. "3 more veterans are moving into the community project next week. They're calling it the Ghost Protocol." Jake chuckled, a sound that finally reached his eyes. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a beacon, a man who had turned his betrayal into a mission of sanctuary for those the world had forgotten. As the sun began to dip behind the Montana peaks, bleeding gold and violet across the sky, Jake reached down to scratch Ghost behind the ears. He looked out over the land, his land, and realized that while he had lost his legs in a desert far away and nearly lost his life on a cliff at home, he had gained something far more resilient. He was surrounded by a new brotherhood, a circle of loyalty where the only orders were to look out for one another. In the quiet of the mountain evening, Jake finally found the peace he had been searching for, guarded by a dog who had stared death in the eye and refused to blink. Here, in the heart of the pines, loyalty wasn't just a word. It was the foundation of everything. Sometimes God doesn't place us on the mountaintop to celebrate. He places us there to test who truly stands beside us. Jake Carter survived war, only to face betrayal at home. Suspended between life and death on a Montana cliff, he discovered that the fiercest warrior isn't always human. Ghost didn't just save a life. He exposed a calculated betrayal months in the making. If this reminded you that loyalty is heaven-sent, type faithful below. Type Amen if you believe God's protection comes in unexpected forms. Subscribe for more inspiring stories.